had a really busy day. Thank you for coming to Ending Circle. We're going to read the book, Make Way for the Ducklings. It's a very old book, but a very enjoyable book. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live, but every time Mr. Mallard thought what he thought looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There was sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles. So they flew on and on. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in a public garden with a little island on it, and the very place to spend the night, quacked Mr. Mallard. So they flapped it down. The next morning, they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. And just as they were getting ready to start on their way, a strange, enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on its back. "Good morning," quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer, but the people on the boat threw peanuts into the water. So Mr. and Mrs. Mallard followed them all around the pond and got a breakfast better than the first one. "I like this place," said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out on the bank and waddled along. "Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right here in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better?" "Good," said Mr. Mallard with delight that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But "Look out!" squawked Mrs. Mallard all a dither. "You'll get ran over." And when she got her breath, she added, "Well, hold it! This is no place for babies with all those horrid things rushing about. We'll have to look for somewhere else." So they flew over Beacon Hill and around the State House, but there were no place there. And they look in Louisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. Then they flew over the Charles River. "This is better," quacked Mr. Mallard. "That island looks quite a nice place, and it's only a little way from the public garden." "Yes," said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. "That looks just like the right place to hatch ducklings." Can you see the island? So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest. And only just in time, for they were now beginning to molt. All of their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until they grew new ones in. course they could swim. And one day they swam over to the park on the river bank, and there they met a policeman called Michael. Michael fed them peanuts, and after that, the Mallards called on Michael every day. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water, or to have her lunch, or to count the eggs and make sure they were all there. One day the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, then Lack, then Mack, and Knack, and Ock, and Pack, and Quack. And Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. One day, Mr. Mallard decided he'd like to take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on. So off he set. "I'll see you in a week in the public garden," he quacked over his shoulder. "Take good care of the ducklings." "Oh, don't you worry," said Mrs. Mallard. "I know all about bringing up children." And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive, she taught them to walk in a line, to come when they were called, and to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. And when at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, and follow me." And before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Ock, Pack, and Quack fell in line just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. There, they waded ashore and waddled along until they came to the highway. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk, honk went the horns on the speeding cart. Squawk went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 quack went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Ock, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings kept right on quack, quack, quacking. They made such a noise that Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. Tweet! He planted himself in the center of the road and raised one hand to stop the traffic and beckoned with the other hand, the way policemen do, for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the Ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to the police booth. He called Clancy at headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street." And Clancy said, "A family of what? Ducks?" yelled Michael. "Send a police car quick." Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned onto Charles Street with Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Ock, Pack, and Quack all marching in a line behind her. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Street said, "Isn't that amazing?" And the man who swept the street said, "Well, now, ain't that nice?" When Mrs. Mallard heard this, she was so proud she tipped her nose in the air and walked with an extra swing in her waddle. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was the police car with the 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from headquarters. The police held back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the Ducklings could march across the street. Right into the public garden. Inside the gate, they all turned around to say thank you to the policeman, and the policeman smiled and waved goodbye. He probably said thank you by going quack, 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 quack. When they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just like he had promised. The Ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long, they followed the swan boat and ate peanuts. And when night falls, they swim to the little island to go to sleep. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for joining me at Indian